Another poll, another day and another blow for the Yes campaign. Support for the Voice continues to decline just weeks out from the October 14 referendum. The latest Newspoll shows only a third of surveyed voters would vote yes. This coincides with a sharp fall in the Opposition Leader Peter Dutton's approval rating as well, which now sits at a record low. Joining me is the Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, those two things not entirely related, but are they completely unrelated?
Oh, look, I think it'd be a mistake to be complacent on polls or to take them in their entirety. In fact, there's a freshwater poll out today that somewhat contradicts what the leadership poll on Peter Dutton shows. So I think we need to look at them in totality, but I think we're a long way away from the end of this electoral cycle. We need to be consistent. I think Peter Dutton's proven that. He took longer than the National Party to get to the principal position of opposing the no, opposing the voice. And we've made sure that we've been consistent and been respectful in that debate. I think what really is showing about in those polls is that the cost of living is really biting Australians. All the Prime Minister's done in less than 18 months is drive up everyone's cost of living and divide our country. That's not something to be proud of, and that's the legacy that Anthony Albanese has already created for this country.
Do you think some on your side of politics are getting a little bit too excited about what this no vote would mean? Do you think those that vote no necessarily translate into support for your side of politics?
Oh, no, definitely not. This is a deeply personal decision for Australians to make, and that's why it's not wise. It'd be unwise to be complacent on any of these polls, to look at them in totality. But I think the biggest poll that we looked at that we'll see before the next federal election is on the 14th of October. I'm proud of the way that the Nationals have prosecuted our case. I think we've set the tone in a respectful way, predicated on intellectual debate rather than on emotion or nastiness, and I hope that continues, and if it doesn't, I'll call it out as I have in the past. But I think we're simply focused for the next 21 days on making sure that our case is prosecuted. I'm proud of the pamphlet that's been put out. The Nationals controlled that, and I think the tone of that was set in a respectful way that was based around fact and the risk that this proposition poses. But there'll be no victory lap if the no case gets up. The Nationals will be respectful and will work constructively with the government and with the Liberal Party in moving forward and advancing, closing the gap, but also any methodology they want to move forward in recognition down the track as well.
I know you focused on the next 21 days, but what about beyond that? I mean, you as a leader in Canberra have a responsibility to bring the nation together after this vote. Have you any thoughts about how you might do that?
Yeah, as I say, there'll be no victory lap from the Nationals. I think it's beholden on the Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, and myself to respect the decision of the Australian people. We shouldn't come out on the 15th of October and try and guilt Australians into feeling bad about the decision. We live in this beautiful country that has democracy, that over 100,000 Australians have lost their lives defending the very principle that we get to go and make this decision in a peaceful way. And as political leaders, it's up to us on the 15th of October to wake up with Australians and dust ourselves off no matter the result and respect the result. That is the beauty of this country, and that's about political leadership, and I intend to do that the very next day, no matter the result. I'll respect the decision and I'll work with whoever to make sure that our country progresses in closing the gap, but also any pathway down the track in properly going through a due process of constitutional recognition.
The polls do show that the unknowns and the fears expressed by the no camp are the messages really permeating. And I want to talk to you about two things in particular. That is treaties. People are worried about treaties, which have nothing to do with the yes vote, really. And they're also worried about things like Australia Day. These are two things that Warren Mundine, for example, said he would like to see pursued and changed.
Well, just on treaties, let me just say that the Prime Minister made very clear on election night and the first day that Parliament sat that he believed in implementing the Uluru Statement of the Heart. Now, the voice is the first part of that. The second part is truth, and the other is Makarrata, which is treaty. Now, some of the proponents that he handpicked that have prosecuted for treaty have been at the table around the design of the voice. So they are statements that Australians should be aware of and understand that if the Prime Minister has made that election commitment and made that commitment after he's been elected, that he will implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
Yeah. But even some of the no camps want a treaty, right? Even some in the no want treaties.
Well, But that's the beholden on the Prime Minister. This is his proposition, and he should be honest about not only what the voice would look like, and when he talks about a fear campaign, he could have actually alleviated a lot of that by actually showing the legislation, bringing up the legislation of how the mechanics of the voice would intrinsically work by tabling the legislation in Parliament, so that not just politicians could see, but every Australian could see before they voted. That is showing respect to the Australian people, and the fact he hasn't done that has meant that many Australians are unsure about what this is. And when he goes to talking about implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there are three elements to that. And even in the Attorney General's speech, in putting this legislation in, he has said quite candidly that this is the first part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, which will include Makarrata. And that's important for Australians to understand, and it's beholden on the Prime Minister to explain that, because this is his proposition, not anyone else's. And if there's fear campaign, it's because the Prime Minister hasn't taken the Australian people into his trust.
But don't you agree that a lot of this voice campaign has been conflated with other issues? We've seen, for example, a lot of land rights claims. That really has nothing to do, that have been elevated in the media, I should say, that really has nothing to do with an advisory body, does it?
No, and the Nationals have never prosecuted that. We've talked about the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. We've talked about the 10 reasons of why we don't believe, and we got to a very principled position that having another Indigenous body will not actually help Indigenous Australians, because we live with that experience of the last time we had that. This is not a new proposition. The Prime Minister is not being truthful when he says the voice is a new proposition. We have had a representative body before. And in my part of the world, where the disadvantage still is, we still...
I mean, there are differences.
It's still a representative body.
It's not exactly the same. Yeah, are you saying we don't need any representative bodies?
No, and I've never said that, Laura, and I've been very consistent on this. This isn't about regional voices. This is about empowering local voices, local elders in each local community. We know to the postcode where the disadvantage is and what that disadvantage is, and we should be empowering the local elders in each of those communities, not on a big regional basis, because this is hard for city people to understand.
But they could very well be part of this representative.
I think it's important to explain this part of it.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it's important for me to explain this part of it, because city people don't appreciate that a regional voice for them is probably 3 or 4 suburbs. For us, it is hundreds of different diverse communities over sometimes nearly 1 million square kilometres, at least hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, where those voices get lost because they get generalised and then they get brought back to Canberra and then they get nationalised. And a program that might work in Cunnamulla won't work in Camberwell.
So,
and that's the mistakes of the past.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. So what are you saying here? You're saying, yes, there should be a representative body, but it should be a lot bigger?
No, we don't. We've got over 300 representative bodies now.
Well, how are these people heard? How are these local leaders heard then in Canberra? How do they speak to the decision makers?
Well, they're not heard in Canberra, and this is what we've always said.
No, but how do you want that to change then?
Look, if I'm allowed to explain it, I'll explain it in detail. We need a 2023 intervention, an intervention in Canberra, taking the bureaucrats out of Canberra and sitting around the town halls and sitting around the campfires with the elders and state and local governments and federal governments, making sure that they design bespoke programs for each one of those communities. And that has been achieved in some communities, but it hasn't been consistent, because we're falling into this trap of thinking we send people to Canberra and it'll all work. When you send people to Canberra, our bureaucrats in Canberra generalise and then they nationalise programs, and it doesn't work. There has been a generosity of financial support for Australians. Over $4 billion has been spent in the last financial year in programs, but they haven't been targeted to the local community. Empowering a local elder in those communities, designing a local program, actually has buy-in by those local communities. Yeah. I've seen it in my own outback communities itself.
I think that is the common sense solutions
the Nationals bring. But we have that lived experience, and this is why we say to people in metropolitan Australia, the Nationals actually have something on this.
There is a logistical challenge in what you're...
There is no logistical challenge.
Well, there is a logistical challenge in what you're suggesting, because it is difficult to make sure there's success in each and every single community. Well, how do you get Canberra. Are you saying Canberra should go to these hundreds of communities and sort them out in that way?
There's these things called aeroplanes, Laura, and what you do is you get bureaucrats out of Canberra, you put them on an aeroplane, and you fly them out to these remote communities, and there's things called cars.
How often?
And
how many communities?
But in each one of them, you're spending $4.1 billion.
Sure.
I mean, if you don't think that you can get better bang for buck...
we don't have the bureaucrats to have them, and it's your government that cut all these public servants. So do we actually have the bodies to go out to these hundreds of communities? I don't know how it's going to work.
Laura, you're overcomplicating this. This isn't about putting bureaucrats and making them live in these communities. They're to go out and listen to the elders and listen to the council structure and state and federal structures that are there and the agencies that are there and coordinate it and make sure that those bespoke programs are designed for each one of those communities. I'm not asking them to move out of Canberra and live there. I'm telling them to get on a plane, get in a car and go and listen to these communities at a local level, because once you go to regional, their voices get diluted, and that's the lived experience that we bring as nationals, and that's why a representative body won't work, and that's why we came out in November last year. And I'm proud of the Nationals that we're saying to City Australians, please, you might think a lot of the Nationals from time to time, but just on this one, I think we've got something to offer because we live it. We live it every day.
Yeah,
and
I
we
agree.
know what will work.
Look, I'm
and what
not
won't
discounting what you're saying at all, but I just, read reports over the weekend about the department's being so understaffed that they're on the verge of collapse, and payment systems are likely,
that's one
to fail.
Agency, one of the agencies.
Sure, but do you not think it's emblematic across Canberra at the moment?
No, not in all parts. I think that'd be dangerous to generalise that. I think you've got to be very careful about generalisations, and even generalisations about support within Indigenous communities for the voice. And this is important that we understand. This is where the rubber should hit the road. But the Prime Minister has conflated constitutional recognition with the mechanics of how we close the gap, and that's a sad part, because what he's done, he's divided the country rather than bring it together. And when there was opportunity where we could work together, listening with the lived experience that we have in getting this right, and we will continue to be constructive as Nats because we're the ones with lived experience on this.
David Littleproud, I always appreciate your time and your fire. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Laura.